Hi, my name's Andrew Shovlin, I'm Trackside Engineering Director and I'm here to answer your questions about the French Grand Prix. So the race. Well, we weren't sure what to expect going into Sunday, and that was certainly the case for Valtteri. Hit from behind by Sebastian on lap 1, caused a puncture which damaged the car, so he was in for the soft tyre, and from there it was just a case of seeing how far we could get that soft to go. Similar story for Vettel, he damaged his nose in that incident, came in for a front wing change, and again soft tyres, see how far you can push them. Life was a bit more simple for Lewis at the front. He was able to control a bit of a gap to the Red Bull, and his race was really about preserving the tyres, making sure you didn't run out because that would have left you vulnerable, and also covering off the SC gaps. Midfield, a fair bit of action because we weren't sure whether you'd be able to overtake, but it turned out the DRS zones were pretty good. A lot of those corners as well, you have multiple lines, and there was some good racing down in the field. So overall, a pretty exciting race. So thank you, Louis, on Facebook for your question about how much downforce did Valtteri actually lose. Well, simple answer, about 5%. And that wasn't from the contact with Vettel. It's actually when the tyre fails, when it punctures, it starts to fall apart, and it's the tyre hitting the floor that does the damage on the way back. So you're trying to drive it slow enough that you don't damage the floor too much, but equally quick enough that you can get back on the train when the safety car restarts. Now the problem was the floor damage wasn't just bits that were knocked off, there were bits that were moving around, and that's why it's a bit more complicated, because in certain corners you lose more or less performance, and Valtteri's big issue was not just the loss of downforce, it was how unpredictable it was. So some corners it was okay, some laps it was okay, but other times it would catch him out and he'd feel a big loss of rear grip, and that would lead to instability. And thank you, Marcel, on Instagram, asking about what we expected from Valtteri following that crash. Well, we didn't really know at the time because you don't know how much damage you've done, so you don't know how fast the car's going to be. We fitted the soft tyre. The instruction to him was fight through the field. Fighting through the field was more important than getting the tyre to the end at that stage. And what we saw was actually he could close on the midfield, and they all had to make a stop. They'd not stopped yet. So relatively early on, you'd say we're looking for a position at the back of the top 6. However, it was one of those races where you've just got to see. You saw in the end that Valtteri actually finished 7th, so we didn't quite make that, but there were points where that looked like a very realistic objective. And we've had a good question in on Twitter. Why did we put Lewis on the soft tyre rather than the ultra soft when we only had 21 laps to do? Well, actually, we didn't have good data from Friday. We had an issue with Valtteri, who was due to long run that soft tyre. So we weren't quite sure how the soft was going to compare to the Ultra. So in the early part of the race, we were looking at the two Renaults. We had Sainz on the Ultra, we had Hülkenberg on the soft. And what you could see from that, there was while the Ultra had a really good initial phase, it would start to degrade, and the soft was the tyre that would probably give you a better stint. It would also mitigate the risk against Verstappen, who was also on the soft tyre, and if we matched strategies with him, it was a safer thing to do. So fundamentally, it just came down to performance, and it's not just about how many laps the tyre will go, it's about the average stint pace and which will get you to the end of the race the fastest. And thank you, Rami, on Instagram, asking about why we made that second stop with Valtteri. Well, there were two reasons really. One is that with the car handling, he was struggling a lot. He'd flat spotted the front tyres. We were getting a bit of vibration, and you saw what happened with Stroll. And if you run that vibration too long, it can actually damage the carcass of the tyre and eventually could lead to a failure. So one part of it was that concern with us that we were growing increasingly worried about during the race. The other issue was that the rear tyres were not in great shape. The damage at the back of the car was causing a loss of grip, that was causing sliding, and we were starting to get quite low on rear rubber. So it was a bit of a mix of factors, but it was a stop that we thought we could recover position. We thought we'd be fast enough to fight through the Renault and the Haas. As it happened, we didn't quite have the opportunity to do that. I think without the BSC at the end, we might have made it happen, but it was pretty close. So we lost a position with that, but what we did was avoided any risk of the tyre failing. Thank you, Annie, on Twitter, asking about how much of a threat Verstappen really was to Lewis. Well, in the early part of the race, the issue is we don't really know how hard we can push the tyres. We don't know how fast that Red Bull's going to be. We don't know whether we're going to run out of tyres at the end of the stint. So Lewis set off, he was working the tyres into a nice region, only able to really pull a tenth or so a lap, but just building a little bit of a buffer, and you're trying to get enough of a gap that you're outside of that undercut threat. As it happened, we were able to get the tyres to last quite well. Lewis started to push a little bit harder, but the key thing was we wanted to stay on track longer than they did, because if we box, leave them out, we then risk losing the win, because there's always the VSC and the safety car threat that would allow them to end up ahead of us. When we got onto that soft tyre, the race becomes a bit easier. We're on the same rubber, but it's fresher. We know it's going to get to the end of the race. We've seen from the first stint that we can handle their pace, and that was really just a case of keeping everything in a sensible condition on the car, making sure we don't damage the tyres, cause a flat spot, and just getting it home to the finish. So thank you everyone for all your questions. We're going to be back next week answering more questions from the Austrian Grand Prix.